So no, yeah, like a small topic, right? There are three problems with being the last guy of the day. The first one and foremost one is I'm the guy standing in the way of cocktails for you guys. And so I hope to keep this mercifully short for you to have some beers and wine. The second problem is when you've got really smart people that precede you, your concepts tend to get pimped out for you before you actually get to talk about them. So a lot of what you will see today, and the third thing, which is actually a nice thing, is that thank God I agree with all of them. So what you'll tend to see here is a little bit of a refresher from some of the things that you've seen earlier today, and hopefully some new things. I don't go nearly as deep. I wanted, because I knew I was going to be the last slide of the day, and when Michael invited me to come out here, I was really excited for mobile. Mobile is such a huge, I think we've all learned today that mobile is this huge, explosive new thing that we need to be dealing with. By the way, how many marketers do we have in the room? I'm curious. They all seem to be on the right side for some reason. Great, and then technical people, sort of developers, I'm curious. One? Oh, two, there we go. All right, and then people who are content strategy people. Great, so lots of content strategy people in the room. Excellent, excellent. And then, so the rest of you are just here. So that's excellent. So I'm going to be talking a lot about marketing because that's my bag of tricks. And so what I'm really going to be positioning things as today is talking about context and how it plays an important role. I'm not going to go into depth here as when I was talking to Michael and we were putting together the agenda for me being the last guy. I didn't want to go into anything deep. So what I'm hoping to do over the next 40 minutes or so as I talk to you is tee up some things that maybe spur some conversation for you at drinks and keep things sort of, again, you'll hear some things that will refresh for you and then hopefully some things to think about, right? So this is going to be less of a tactical type of presentation and more of just big ideas for you to think about because context-aware everything is certainly something that we don't have to deal with. One of the things I was thinking about in the break is Karen and Eaton's presentation was so great and it's so refreshing actually to hear somebody talking about content as a platform and something that we should be thinking about as a platform rather than sort of these device and interface-centric things. But let me just give you all, especially for those of you who have small websites and smaller businesses, you don't have to do this on Monday. Because I got depressed thinking about all of the to-dos about making my content available over an API platform as they were going through their presentation. But something struck me as really interesting about context, and it played an important role in terms of me thinking about this presentation, and I think it's just so apropos. This was a quote given by a guy named Aaron Kubler at a recent TED Talk. If you haven't seen this TED Talk yet, it is really wonderful. It has nothing to do with content or marketing or anything. It's about, he basically is a media artist and he does visual design over data. So he takes large data sets and puts visualizations to them. And he opened up with this quote, which he actually didn't attribute to himself, and I can't find the attribution anywhere online, but so I'm going to attribute it to him, which is basically the 21st century will be defined by the interface. And I think it's just so appropriate about the explosion of ideas and interfaces and content consumption that is really taking over what we're doing as marketers and what our audiences are doing as consumers of content. And the context by which that content is consumed, and by the way, I wish we had alcohol because a drinking game here would be how many times am I going to say the word context in this presentation, because we would all be slizzard by the time we got out of here. It's all about the uniqueness that is you, right? We all bring unique benefits and we all bring our unique selves to this conference, to the businesses we operate, to our lives. And context is really that meaning that we derive out of our lives. And so just speaking of uniqueness really quickly here, I would like to connect with all of the unique yous out there. This is my contact information if you're doing any live tweeting or if you feel like stopping by the blog or anything, and I would love to connect with all of you. I've connected with some of you already during the conference and would certainly love to connect with all of you at some point and learn from you because I'm learning a ton at this conference. And so just to start things off, let's talk about the context effect because cognitive psychologists, they've got a word for this sort of uniqueness that we bring to how we derive meaning out of things. They call this the context effect. And there's sort of several stages here that we can talk about context a little bit. There's inference in context, decision in context, and contextual conditioning. And so there's others, but these are three really parts of the major pieces of the context effect. And just as an example, we'll use that image there on the right. So all of you have this sort of image and context in your head about what that thing is and what it does. You know, it's just a piece of metal with some plastic around it. It's got a shape to it. But if a guy came in here waving one of those things right now, what would you do? Would you dive for cover? Would we scream? Would we run out of the room? You would put context around the person waving that thing. Now, what if that person came in with that thing on his hip and he was wearing a badge and a blue cap and a blue suit? Well, maybe some of you would still dive for cover because you're wanted by the law, but most of you probably wouldn't. But if he was wearing a ski cap or a ski mask, what would you do then? Would you would, basically that's inferred context. We look at things, and based on the things around it, we start to derive meaning out of that thing. So then there's decisions in context, the decisions that we make about that context, whether we run out of the room or not. Great example of that is how I drive when my wife is sitting in the car next to me versus how I drive when I'm alone. I make a conscious decision based on the context of where I am in the car and who is sitting next to me about how I'm actually going to behave. And that's decisions in context. Another one might be, you might be a complete wallflower at parties. You know, you take your glass of wine and you stand by the wall and you sort of wait for the party to come to you, versus at a conference like this where you might be really outgoing because you're making a conscious decision that, hey, I paid to be here, I need to actually make some business contacts, and so I'm actually going to make the conscious decision to not be a wallflower and actually go out and meet people. So decisions in context. Then the third is contextual conditioning, which is a really interesting one for us as marketers because we spend a lot of time here. This is really how we've directed our careers, is to think about contextual conditioning. We get celebrities, right, where the cultural biases or how we've been brought up, or basically by groups of people, that context that people put against various things. So we hire Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or somebody to actually pitch our products for us. Or we have different contexts that we put in place based on our upbringing. I'll give you a quick example. Anybody know who this, now if you read ahead on this slide share, you're not allowed to answer this question, but anybody know who this guy is? Anybody? He's huge. He's a pop star in the order of, he's one of the biggest pop stars in the world today. So he sold 28 million albums. He's as big as Rihanna. He's huge. Everybody knows who Rihanna is, right? So he's a huge pop star. Does world tours, stadium tours, Australia, in China, all throughout Asia. He does huge stadium tours. He actually did a world tour where he played in Los Angeles at the Shrine Auditorium, in Vegas at the MGM Grand. Huge pop star. He just made his U.S. acting debut. And now, when I show you and put it into context for what you probably have the contextual relevance for him, it starts to make sense, right? And now you have a different impression of Jay Chou, who played Kato in the movie The Green Hornet, that you might not have had before. You didn't maybe know that he was the biggest pop star in China. And you didn't know that he sold 28 million records. And so that contextual conditioning, another quick example here. Anybody can tell me what continent that is? Africa, thank you. I know it's getting late, but... So one of the things about the size of Africa and Africa in general, and the way we look at the world, is how we were brought up. How many people do we have here who are not from the United States, who didn't go to school in the United States? Oh, surprising number, actually. Where, just out of curiosity, where? Canada. You say that with such a shrug. Canada. It's just Canada. By the way, is it mobile or mobile? I'm just really curious. We had mobile before, and we've had mobile. So where in the back? Canada. Canada. Yeah, it's like Canada. Sorry. Sorry, it's not more exciting. Well, this is Africa. But those of us in the States, I don't know in Canada, but in some European countries you get different maps. But here in the States, this is the map we grew up with as kids, right? This is how we look at the world. This is our view of the world right here. And we can see there's the United States, and there's our giant thing called Alaska up there, and there's South America, and there's Africa, and there's Russia. And if I told you that Libya is actually the exact same size as Alaska, actually a little bigger, you'd go, wait a minute, what? And you go, yeah, actually, let's look at the actual size of Africa. So this is Africa, the actual size. There's the United States, there's Spain and France, there's Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, there's China, there's the second part of China, there's India, there's Greece, the UK. Basically all of Europe, all of the United States, all of China, all of India fit inside of Africa. Africa's huge. And it gives us a different context. And it's because we've grown up with this context of what we think the world looks like based on maps that we've done, that we have a different context about what Africa's real size is. So that's contextual conditioning. And we marketers have really lived our lives by this, right? We've thought about advertising and our marketing message very, very carefully about how we place our media and our marketing message. Because why? Because we pay for it. We pay for that advertising. We pay for that marketing message to go out, and we care very deeply about what kind of context or meaning is derived out of it. So we'll think about things when we deploy a media strategist. Should we be thinking about, if we're selling a piece of software, is it a Microsoft audience or is it really an Apple audience? And they think differently about things. And those audiences, they think differently and they derive different meanings out of how we'll market our story. Or is being green important? That might have a different meaning to someone who's more right-wing and conservative and all that, and I'll get out of the politics really quickly here. But, the marketing a green or, that kind of marketing message, is that important for us? Or can the Cubs win a pennant? The ever sort of adventure here, can the Cubs ever win a pennant? Well, that's probably not a marketing message I want to spend too much time on here in Chicago, but maybe it's something I want to talk about in Boston or New York or LA or something like that. So those marketing message, how we have basically operated as marketers and trying to perceive how we can take a contextual meaning to our marketing, our advertising messages, played a huge role. And really, it's basically been all about the media, right? How can we place this so targeted? We're careful about where we place our billboards, and sometimes we just get entirely unlucky about the contextual where it's going to end up. We just get entirely unlucky. I mean, the media placement person for McDonald's is just got to be shooting themselves over this, right? So, by the way, must the diabetes people. But sometimes we just get entirely unlucky about what message is going to work, where that ad placement goes, and what the context is going to be. But in addition to that, technology, for all of the discussion that's gone on today, hasn't done us any real favors either, right? So a few years ago, search contextualization around advertising was all the rage. We were going to all get, contextually relevant ads, and we still are to some extent, but it's not doing us any favors either, right? So we see this Folgers ad with what might trigger another. Now, I don't know why I picked two ads with heart attacks, by the way, so that was just completely coincidental. And then sometimes when we were thinking as marketers about our targeted advertising message, we just get it wrong. We just completely F it up, right? So here's Mitchell. He's thought this through. This is a brilliant ad he's put on the side of his van. It's just so awesome, but he just really didn't think it through. He just really didn't think it through. We just sometimes don't think through what we do as marketers in terms of the contextual relevance that we're going to have with our targeted messaging. And that's really the important thing. So here's the thing, and this has been said so much better than I'll say it today with content strategy. We've spent our careers as marketers thinking this through with our paid advertising and our paid marketing messages, but we just haven't thought it through as it comes to our digital content on our websites. Whether it's mobile, whether it's whatever, we're still in this idea of all the content that prints to fit, right? We just dump it out there, right? It's just basically whatever the CEO or the VP of marketing, whatever it wants, just get that content out there. And a lot of times it's because we've got this long tail idea, right? We've been imbued with this idea that search is it. Search is the most important thing. So long tail searches, we've got to get thousands of pages of web content out there. We've got to just dump every piece of content we have out on the web and make it Googleable so that we can actually find this content and somehow draw people in. But we haven't really thought about context at all. Maybe if we've read Christina's book, maybe if we've worked with some of these content strategists, we start to think a little more strategically about our content. We start to do things, but honestly, time gets in the way. We start just, again, architecting this content in a way that is really just about putting it up on the web and not thinking about the context by which it's going to be consumed. This is a great site, by the way, arngren.net. It's actually live. You can actually go there now. What you don't see here, by the way, this is an e-commerce site. What you don't hear, this horizontally scrolls. And it vertically scrolls. It's awesome. And if you horizontally scroll, by the way, there's all kinds of blinking, GIFs, and it's just a super awesome website. So that's really what we need to start thinking about, is the context by which we're deploying content. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. Before we get into a little bit about where we are with context, let's talk a little bit about the future of context. So Gartner, and it's actually one of the few areas I think. Do we have anybody from Gartner in the room, by the way? Okay, good. It's the only thing I think Gartner's actually doing anything worthy of thinking about, is really in this idea of what they're calling contextually aware computing. And there's some really interesting thinking going on there by this guy. William Clark is one of the analysts at Gartner, and he's put out a couple of papers, and there's a few videos out, and he's spoken at a few conferences. And they're talking about contextually aware computing. And this really feeds into that idea that this century is really all about the interface and redesigning UX to be appropriate and hyper-personalized for users across all of the interfaces. And that includes mobile and the refrigerator and the car and all of the different things that we're interacting with every single day with our content consumption. And that's what they really say is over the next 5 years, the bar for this UX is just going to get increasingly raised by the fact that we have to be contextually aware. We've got to start delivering much more contextually relevant interfaces and content to our users, to our consumers. Why is that? Why has this shift occurred? Why has this 5 years reached the tipping point? You know, what is it that's happened really with consumers of content that has led them down this road where we've reached this idea that contextually relevant content is important? Well, they talk about the future. And they talk about it in all kinds of they talk about it in everything, right? They talk about it from security standpoint, they talk about it from e-commerce, they talk about it from content, they talk about it from, and I tend to think like a marketer. And so in my marketing rabbit brain, I kind of segmented it into these 5 or 4 S's rather. So just so I can put some perspective on it as a marketer of how I start to think about contextually aware content. And so and all of these have been talked about today in some fashion or form, and I think really in depth, and I won't go into depth on them, but just to give you a sense of it, there's social, right? Using our social graph to make things contextually relevant for us. Using the fact that I'm friends with you and friends with you and friends with you to give me something that might be more contextually relevant to me. Also our preferences or our tags, basically all the concepts that we're starting to associate ourselves with. If you look at my tag cloud on Twitter versus somebody else's, it's going to be entirely different. So the concepts that we start associating ourselves with. Then there is security, and I'm not going to touch on security very deeply at all, but just things like privacy for sure, but also model-based security. Am I delivering content to you based on the fact that you're authenticated to get in here? Or am I delivering content differently to you on the company-issued BlackBerry versus your personal iPhone? Do I give you access to content in a different way? So security operated or model-based contextual security. And then there's subscribe, what I call subscribe, and this is really where I want to spend a little bit of time because as marketers, this is where we really care about. This is how our consumers are pulling in our content these days, and we've got to deliver contextually relevant messages to them to do that thing that we want them to do as marketers, which is buy something, download something, read something, or just basically do something that we want them to do as marketing people. And then finally, search, no big surprises here. This is Google, this is Bing, this is our internal site searches, giving people personalized experiences based on their outreach into our content repository to give them something that's relevant back to them in a contextually relevant way. So how does that sort of begin to stratify itself when I start thinking about solutions and I start looking at client-based solutions? And just to give you some sense of the landscape of vendors here, right? So I start looking at social and I see, of course, the usual suspects, Facebook and Twitter, LinkedIn, Foursquare, where I start looking at that augmented reality that we were talking about earlier in the day. That augmented reality is really an important thing, and it's a contextually relevant piece of content that I'm now being delivered based on my location, based on the fact that I'm in a store, etc. Looking at Twitter and Facebook as methods of data that can provide context regarding some content that I might be reading. Security, vendors like ValidSoft, 41st Parameter, where they're doing things like model-based security against either corporate intranets, or basically content repositories where I may or may not have access given the device I have, given whether I'm outside the firewall, given whether I'm accessing at 9 o'clock at night versus 8 o'clock in the morning. The subscribe piece, there's really 2 aspects to subscribe. There's managing content, and then there's delivering and consuming content. And the managing content, of course, this is what we're talking about with content management systems that we talked earlier about and how we manage that content. Just a really interesting tangent. There's one of the extra steps, right? So we talked, Karen and Neaton were talking about using an API to deliver content in a really relevant way. There's actually a couple of vendors out there that are doing the other side of that, which is giving the content available in an API so that different organizations of a government organization can actually manage it using any web content management system they want, right? So that's a really interesting way to handle giving the users the ability to use whatever interface that they need to manage content, not just deliver it to consumers in a contextually relevant way. For open source projects like Hippo, those guys are thinking about contextually aware content a little bit. Companies like UsableNet, they are actually using platforms to publish out to refrigerators and to iPads and to all the other stuff like that. And then Digby, that are delivering content where you walk into a Target store and you get all of a sudden a text message that says there's a deal available to you, knowing that you're in the store probably to buy something and you want to get a relevant piece of content. And then Google and Bing, and I think these have been in the news recently, right? The new Panda update to the search algorithm, all of the Bing using Facebook now to deliver you more relevant results. All of these are starting to become much more important in terms of the things that we need to be aware of as marketing people. So then it's just one layer down from that. How does it actually work in real life? Well, these are sort of three examples. This one was talked about today, forgetting his name, but talked about today, the guy from ComScore with the Yelp application where you can actually point your phone and you actually see the actual restaurants that have the social aspect to it, you know, where their ratings are and that sort of thing. We've got Google Goggles, which is the search function, right? I just point my phone at something and instantly I can do a Google search on it and get relevant search results back. And then Wikitude, which is a really cool app. You point it at something, and if there's a Wikipedia entry for it, it'll actually automatically pull it in, subscribing to that piece of content in a contextually relevant way. So just really, quote-unquote, basic things that are starting to get done with using context as a filter to display content in a more relevant way to our users. Your imagination can start to run here, right? You can start to think about all of the different things that we can do to really deliver on the future and this vision of having an API, having a contextually relevant, automated delivery set of content. But really, that's certainly the future and the vision. But what about today? What do we do what do we do Monday? Right? What do we do on Monday with our content repository and our content strategy? We got to do something on Monday. I mean, we have to justify this trip somehow, right? So if we had a mobile site, if we did a mobile version of our website up until literally this conference, when it's been made abundantly clear that a mobile version of our website is not a good idea, we were geniuses, right? We were geniuses with the mobile version of our website. And so if it didn't basically break, if our website didn't break in the iPhone browser or on BlackBerry, basically whatever the CEO carried, if our website didn't break in that browser, we were all of a sudden geniuses. But it's still that mentality of basically all the content that prints to fit. We're not thinking about our content in a way that's contextually relevant for the particular device or the particular person, which is really the idea here about in context. So this is why I think that shift has started to occur. And it's really about the consumer and their expectations about content. And this was sort of touched on in the ComScore presentation, and other people today have also touched on this idea of the consumer now being in control. The consumer is now expecting content to be all of a sudden relevant for their experiences, right? So whether it's Hulu or Pandora or all of the iPhone apps or Boxee or Roku or Netflix, these are all content applications that are basically letting us filter content how and where and when we want it. And so, audiences basically now expect this content, and they choose when it's going to happen. Just as a quick example of that, 46 million homes, and this is the number from ComScore, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but 46 million homes now have basically a TV with a broadband connection to the internet. This is fascinating to me because, just a quick story here. So I went up and saw my niece last weekend, and I was pulling some stuff up from my brother-in-law, and one of the things I pulled out was that item there at the top of the screen. Everybody knows what that is, right? The millennials know what this is? Okay. My niece, my 12-year-old niece, did not. She did not know what this thing was. And she said, "What is this thing?" And I said, "Well, it's a record player." And she said, "Well, what do you do with it?" I said, "Well, you put records on it, and you play music with it. And it actually plays music." And she said, "Well, do it." I said, "Well, I don't have any records here. All my records are at home." And she said, "Well, what's a record?" And so I spent the next half hour talking to her about what vinyl was and records and big formats. And she said, "Wow, that sounds like a real pain." It then morphed. When I was a kid, that was home entertainment system, right? I spent hours on Saturday, headphones on, listening to the first Boston album, just jamming out on, next to my bed with one of those things. But then it moved into this, right? I was so excited as a teenager to get one of these in my bedroom. I could actually flip and watch secretly Monty Python's Flying Circus at night and all of that sort of thing, and in black and white even. And now we have this. This is what kids are growing up with now. This thing is a giant monitor that hangs on your wall, and it starts to stretch the imagination when I say, if I put this new Samsung thing on my wall that comes already included with Skype, with Facebook, with Twitter, broadband connection, you literally plug your Ethernet in, boom, there you go. and it's got web access, and I don't sign up for cable or satellite, is it a television anymore? It's not even really a TV. It's just something that we access entertainment with. And that's really where we're going with this content consumption. 800,000 people last year cut the cord with their cable provider. And they're basically only doing things like Hulu and Apple TV and downloading movies off the internet and using peer-to-peer networks to actually download entertainment. Netflix now, and this is, I know, a debatable number, but Netflix now has a big chunk of bandwidth in prime time. Some people say it's 20%, some people argue with that, but basically Netflix, in terms of the popularity of what's going on with downloadable and content on demand, is just a huge piece of how consumers are now expecting the content. And that shift has moved over to us as marketers too. They now expect our content to be available as well. Great stat here that I actually heard. Kids 18 to 24, 100% of them now expect that if they go search for your business's website online using their mobile device, that they will not only find it, that it will be up to date and reflect accurate content. 100% of them expect it. So if you don't have that, you're disappointing, and you market to 18 or 24-year-olds, you're missing out because they now have that expectation about your content. So on the mobile side of things, it's absolutely exploded as well. So this is really talking about how those interfaces have just exploded on us. You know, the ComScore numbers, it's not fair. He gets like fresh ComScore numbers. I get like what I can find on the internet. So he gets 30% of mobile subscribers are now smartphone users, and 40% of mobile Americans are now browsing the mobile web. Those are huge numbers, of course. But the one that really killed me, the one that just dissuaded me, this was a number that came out of the Consumer Electronics Association this year. The average household now has 24 content creation or content consumption gadgets. It's the average household. Basically, 2 computers, 3 laptops, 2 video-capable cameras, 2 cell phones, a scanner, 3 TVs, 3 DVRs, a set-top box gaming device like an Xbox or a PlayStation, a Kindle, and an iPad. The number of interfaces that we have to develop content for is just overwhelming. I mean, I think in Karen and Eaton's presentation, it was just, I mean, you can literally just be overwhelmed by the number of to-dos that all of a sudden you have on your list that you have to start developing design interfaces for and content strategies for. And that's really the key, is putting that into, wait for it, context about what we're going to do. Just one last stat here, because this one fascinated me as well. These are the top 5 free iPad apps, right? All of them about content filtering, when I want it, where I want it, and how I want it. Whether it's books, weather, movies, television, it's all about segmenting content and filtering it on demand and expecting it in the way that I want it. So, contextual break. It's a lot of numbers and a lot of stats. And what does it all mean? Because I listened to the stats from the ComScore guy, and I was overwhelmed with, you know, like what do all those numbers, what do all those stats mean, right? Are apps going to win? Or is Apple going to take over the world? Does Android win? What is Android anyway? Is it really an OS, or is it a platform, or is it different OSs because they're all so different? And is Nokia going to get bought by Microsoft at some point? You know, all of that. What does all that mean? I don't know. I leave that to the analysts to really figure out. As a marketing guy, I look at all of those trends and I sort of come away with 3 pieces of advice. And the first is we don't need, bless you, we don't need or want a mobile version of our existing site. Yes, this is the part where I agreed with everybody who came before me. We absolutely don't need it. If we take away one thing from this weekend, we should absolutely say to ourselves, if our CEO comes in and says, we need a mobile version of our site up tomorrow, we should say, no, absolutely not. We don't need to. And if he says, why? You'll say, because Karen and Eaton told me not to. And I'll say, all right, great. And the app versus mobile web, that's not an either or. You know, as was made very clear in their presentation and others today, this is not an either or strategy. This is not an interface strategic move. We've got to think about this from a content strategy perspective. We've got to think about, first and foremost, our content strategy and then channels. That's the real way that we win here, because whether or not we can deliver on the future and whether or not we need to deliver on the future, if you have a 100-page website, you will never need a contextually aware platform with an API. You just won't. You just won't, because your content is too limited, your business is too focused, you just won't need that. But if we can become contextually aware as marketers and start to deliver more relevant messages to our constituents based on what we are looking at and using context as a filter when we put together that content marketing strategy or that content strategy, then we win. So, as I said, 99.9% of you are never going to need this. And as we start looking at what we need to do to take the first step, so how do we take that first step into a context-aware strategy that really starts to include that as part of our thinking, as part of our business? Well, before I jump into that, and I've struggled a little bit, and thankfully it's interesting, it hasn't come up as much today, but in other conferences I've watched it come up with this whole term called the mobile web. And I struggled with that term a long time because for me the mobile web was always like, well, there was no laptop web, there was no PC web, there was no, there's not an iPhone web, there's the web, right? And the device and creating a strategy based on a device or even a singular interface seems to me so arbitrary in pulling it out. So I don't know how that plays into all the stats and the methodologies for how, who's going to win and what the mobile web really looks like and the population and all of that sort of thing. Because if I'm on a laptop and I'm using my Sprint MiFi connection to connect, am I on the mobile web or am I on just the regular web with a bigger desktop? So, really what I think about is this is us at the train station, right? This is how we behave now. You come to the train station now and there are 42 of this person, right? We don't talk to each other anymore. We stare into our devices, right? This is once we get picked up to the train station, this is us driving home. And so, we're basically driving home, and then when we get to the party, this is us at the party. Basically looking into our screens and sharing content that we're finding, settling debates, settling a bet at the bar, doing all those sorts of things. And then this is us when we get home from the party, right? So, and then the marriage doesn't last very long after that. So, putting that into context, what do we actually need to start thinking about? Well, when I start thinking about it, there was some research done by this company called Answer Labs, and they actually asked these mobile web folks why they were actually accessing content on the mobile web. And when I mean mobile web these days, what I mean by that is that which we are accessing on the go. So we are the mobile web. We as people on the mobile web. That naturally sort of tends to lend itself toward a smaller screen, a handheld device, an iPad, those sorts of things. But it's really about our purpose for consuming that content and who we are as people that makes up the mobile web, not the interface or the device itself. And so those three questions were asked of people who were consuming content using the mobile web, and they came away with these three reasons. And I think they've been really talked about at length today in terms of what they are. But really, they were in those, and that was, by the way, also the priority. And it was really interesting to see. I didn't have this ComScore number. It was really interesting to see that content sharing and social media was the fastest growing earlier today in the ComScore presentation, because it's the third most when they did this study, but it's actually the fastest growing there. So when we're putting together our content marketing strategy or our content strategy more holistically, and we're starting to think about that, even if we're not looking at doing an API, and even if we're not looking at automatically having our content be optimized for a particular set of contextual things, we can start thinking about it. We can start applying that to our content strategy. So we can ask ourselves, should our content be entertaining? We love us some Angry Birds, right? And so how can we do that, right? And there was a great question asked earlier about, well, if I'm B2B and I'm targeting B2B, is my content ever going to be entertaining? Well, maybe no, but maybe yes. I certainly subscribe to a number of tech blogs that are B2B-ish focused as I'm waiting for the plane, or if I'm sitting waiting for my wife to show up at a restaurant, or whatever I'm doing, and I've got this, I'm staring into my phone trying to kill some time. So that entertaining aspect of it can just as easily be, how do we let our audience consume our content that might otherwise be done in an entertaining way? And a quick example, a client that I work with is a financial services company. And they deal with the time suck of all time sucks, the Wall Street community. And these guys have no patience for anything. They basically want their content, they want it now, they are on the move, they're in taxis, they're on the train, they're on the plane, they're moving. But the content that these guys produce is important to them. It's advice on stocks, and it's advice on what company's doing what, and where their analysis is on particular items. Now, what we did here, very simple thing. They're a small organization, very small organization, and so they're, the number of pages on their website is really small. The number of subscribers is relatively small, but they basically have a very important piece of content that they deliver to a very loyal and passionate community. And so what we did was we created a microblog specifically for mobile, right? So we created this microblog specifically for mobile because these guys access all their stuff on BlackBerries, right? Some stockbrokers and wealth managers have iPhones, but most of them, in New York anyway, have BlackBerries. They're issued BlackBerries. And instead of delivering this through email, we delivered it through a text message because we didn't want to get buried in their email list. So when the new video was available, and these were 30-second to 1-minute videos only, giving them just the headlines of what they needed to know. So these were pieces of snackable content that their audience could consume very quickly while they're waiting for that cab, while they're waiting for the plane. And in that video, they then teed up the idea that there's a 5 to 10 minute version of this video available on the website. So when they got home that night, they could actually go check out the website and check out this piece. That video blog is the only thing they produce. They basically just produce that blog of videos for their mobile audience, and it's great, and their audience loves it. It's a very small little thing that they could do to give a very specific set of content in a very contextually relevant way for their particular audience. Another idea. Anybody here go to NTEN, the Nonprofit Technology Conference? Anybody? So NTEN is a nonprofit organization. They do a conference every year that focuses on technology for nonprofits. And I spoke at it last year, and they did a really cool thing. They actually created an iPhone app that went beyond sort of the traditional sort of, you download an app and you get the schedule of events at the conference. What they did was a really cool thing because they wanted their content to be productive. So it is about a task, it is about a tool, it is about making ourselves more productive when we're doing a particular thing. But it can also be around content, centered on content and a content-driven strategy. So what they did was a really cool thing. They basically had a Twitter client that they built into this iPhone app so that you could not only just read tweets, you could actually, if you had a Twitter account, you could actually tweet out. But they also had, as a filter in here, they built all the hashtags for all the talks. So you didn't have to go online and search for this. You could actually just get all the hashtags for all the talks right there. So you could immediately browse right through them. It was really cool. Then they also did a really cool thing with the vendors, right? So they basically added all the vendors and a map to where they were on the location floor with and so you could actually schedule out when you wanted to go see what vendor, etc. And then the final thing that they did, which was I thought just the coolest, was they created an event blog that they fed through the iPhone app only. And so basically this was content, they live blogged every session at the event, and basically you could use the iPhone app to see what was going on in all the sessions, and then you also had an archive of it. Because the iPhone app then lived beyond the life of the conference, where you could go in and you could see all the relevant tweets, you could see all of the relevant blog posts, and you could see the vendors that attended and get their contact information in case you had forgotten to do that. So how long did it live after the usefulness after the event? Who knows? Maybe a few months, maybe a few days. Doesn't matter. They centered a content strategy around a specific mobile app and gave it to them that was only useful during that contextual experience, which is around that particular event. This is exactly what Eaton was talking about, where if you have something that's going to live for only a temporary piece of time, an event, a campaign, it's perfectly okay to have a content strategy that says, we're going to develop this very specific thing for this very specific purpose. And that's a completely okay thing to do, to start thinking about context. And then finally, just another example here of how our content can be shareable, right? So this is, we can start thinking about how our content is shareable using a content strategy. I got the pleasure of talking with Tom Hone at Kodak a little while ago when I wrote an article for iMedia Connection and talked to him about content marketing and his strategy there. And they've got an app that they call the Smile Maker. It's a silly little thing that they do. It's basically you download it, and as you can see, you can apply any of a number of templated smiles to a picture, right? So if you've got somebody who's frowning in a picture, you can basically give them the Lisa smile. And then they encourage you to share it. You can share it online with your friends, on Facebook, on Twitter. You can text it to somebody. Basically, the whole idea is, wait for it, sharing smiles. And so it's a wonderful little brand reinforcement thing for them that they can actually do as a piece of their content marketing strategy. And one of the things that I really loved was when I talked to Tom, he talked about how they didn't just copy content. It wasn't just about taking content and copying it from place to place, but it's actually integrating it and putting it into the appropriate channels for which it is designed. And that's a really key piece of making things more contextually relevant. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about content strategy because it has been spoken of so much more eloquently than I ever will. But really taking that first step is starting to really apply context to our content strategy. Looking at the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why we're doing these things. Why is our audience doing these things? Really going through and developing our personas. Really going through and developing those personas with depth so that we understand why these people are accessing this content through different channels, and so that we can determine whether content reuse is an important piece of our strategy or whether we want to develop something very specific and separate for what we're actually doing there. So that's really it, is taking a real content strategy, and they all seem to be lined up here. But basically, these content strategists, hire them, bring them into your businesses and have them work with you to really put together a content strategy that makes sense, because that is what will help you layer in context as an important filter into why you're delivering content. And then, and only then, start to look at technology solutions that can start to help you optimize that stuff automatically. Really. And so there are technology solutions out there that will do things like look at ambient data that you've got different content for if I'm in Texas versus if I'm in New York, that will actually look at my browser device and automatically redirect me. We actually used one of those for the financial services company that I talked to you about, where we would redirect them to the right browser optimized video based on whether they were coming in through an iPhone or a BlackBerry. Explicit data. Do we know something about you explicitly? Have you told us that you're a vice president from Georgia? Have you told us that you're male or female? Have you told us that your name is Bob? All of these different kinds of data we can start to use to automatically optimize content for more relevance and contextual awareness. And finally, of course, behavioral referral data. Did they come in from a paid Google search? Did they come in from an organic Google search? Are they coming from some campaign that we're running? All of those different types of things. Starting to use technology, and there are content management systems out there, and there are also content optimization systems out there that will do all of this, but only do this because this becomes like the A/B testing and multivariate testing and content targeting and segmentation as marketers. It's the sexiest thing that nobody does. And so if we do a content strategy properly first, and we start ourselves becoming context aware, then and only then start to apply technology to automatically start to optimize that based on our visits. And so if I want to leave you with 4 things, is that understand that context-aware platforms are coming. It's really, I think this day has been about sort of raising the bell, alarm rather, and saying that context-aware platforms are on the horizon. They are coming, and it is becoming an increasingly important piece of how we are going to deliver content to our audiences, no matter how big or no matter how small. And if we start to look at how context will become an important part of our content strategy, it's an important first step in terms of what we're doing from a marketing strategy and optimizing our content for that context. But just understand, we don't have to do this tomorrow. We don't have to deliver the vision of the Yelp application for our content, or this supervision with the goggles and everything. We don't have to do all that tomorrow. We don't have to deliver the API tomorrow. What we need to do tomorrow, on Monday, is start to become aware and start to apply that filter of context to how we're handling our content strategy. And that's the real important piece here, is that take that first step to be aware of context, to be aware of context awareness, and apply the filter to our strategy as is appropriate to the size and reason for our businesses. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, and I hope I didn't stand too much in the way of cocktails. Yeah. I'd love questions, yeah. How'd I do on time? Felt like I went fast.
I just wanted to comment on the, is content entertaining? So the CDC wanted to get people interested in preparing an emergency kit for hurricanes. So they created something called Preparedness 101 Zombie Apocalypse. And they wrote a whole bunch of pages.
I just saw that.
Preparing for a
So
zombie
awesome.
apocalypse. Yeah. So even you're seeing in .gov situations, which, no offense, but I work for the federal government, I'm not necessarily the most creative or willing to be innovative, but you're even seeing them sort of start to embrace thinking about content, getting people hooked in different ways.
Yep, and there's some really interesting, so that's a fantastic example. And then, and I was talking with Eaton during the break, there's also some great examples of governments that are actually doing the API thing. So if you get a chance, I tweeted this out, but if you look at data.co.uk, they actually have an entirely open API for accessing all of the government data. And so basically they invite people to build interfaces on top of this data and mash it up and put it into interesting interfaces all over. There's also a really interesting case study with the Dutch libraries. that are doing this as well. They're the ones that are actually doing it in both ways, letting you come in and access the content through the API and format it in different ways, but also they're providing the API access to all of the individual branches, some of whom have Drupal, some of them have Joomla, some of them have different content management systems, and all of them access it in different ways. So the government space is actually doing some really interesting things in terms of looking at content as a platform and context accordingly. Yes?
So I was really interested in this slide where you said 99.9% of you won't need to worry about this anyway. Something
Yeah.
that I really struggle with is when we give these grand visions of
Yes.
like rainbows and unicorns, and people are just like, I can't get people to turn in content
Exactly.
from my website.
Yep.
Where does that line? Where do you draw that line? I mean, how can you assess what your actual needs are, whether it's right now or in the future, with where your company is?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is, and she didn't tee me up for this, I promise, is that you get a great content strategist to help you with that question. But I think to not be glib about it, I think there's a size of content and the purpose of that content that really plays an important role. If you're a B2B manufacturer and your whole purpose on the web is basically to have a brochureware site and all of your stuff is done through phones and relationships and stuff like that, having that content available through an API is useless to you, right? It's just or a nonprofit organization. If you're a nonprofit organization, the website you have over here that's collecting donations and it talks about your mission and it's got your annual report, making that available over an API is probably not very productive. But if it is, right? I know small organizations, the Dutch libraries are a great example, right? The Dutch libraries are actually a relatively small organization, but the content that they had, they're the library for, they're the library, so they have to have this idea of open content as part of their mission. And so for them it was extraordinarily important, even though their corpus of content was not so astronomically huge as to say, okay, that makes sense. The 99.9% thing is, to me, is most of us in this room, I dare say all of us in this room, we're not Netflix, we're not Amazon, we're not, we're not something that where we have 2 million items in our SKU, and with partners coming in, adding in third-party content, and we just don't have that problem. And so figuring out an automated content platform that takes context in is probably not, but from a technology point of view. But from a process point of view, us being aware of it, I think, is extraordinarily important.